Alina stared at the computer screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as tears blurred her vision. She had typed and deleted this message at least 10 times, each draft more frantic, more desperate. She needed to say it, to release the suffocating weight that had clamped down on her chest for the past year. But where would it go? Who would read it? And what would they think of her if they did? Life hadn't always been this complicated. A year ago, Alina had been part of a seemingly ordinary family. She and her husband, Mark, were raising 2 bright, curious children in a cozy apartment that often smelled of fresh-baked cookies and the chaos of crayons and school projects. Mark was a calm, practical man, the kind of father who made pancakes shaped like animals and spent weekends fixing things around the house. Life was predictable, and for the most part, it was good. Until the strokes. They had come like an ambush, one after the other, stealing Mark's sharp wit and gentle demeanor in a matter of days. Alina had stood by his hospital bed, her hands gripping the cool metal railing, listening to the doctors explain terms she barely understood. She had nodded as they spoke, her mind reeling at phrases like permanent damage and progressive dementia. She had held on to hope in those early days, willing herself to believe that Mark would recover, that their life would regain some semblance of normalcy. But that hope had eroded like sand under relentless waves. Mark came home a different man. At first, it was little things. He couldn't remember where he had left his phone. He struggled to follow conversations. Alina chalked it up to recovery, telling herself that healing would take time. But then came the moments of confusion. Mark forgetting what room he was in, panicking because he didn't recognize his children, staring at the stove as if it were a foreign object. The official diagnosis came months later: frontal-temporal dementia. The words felt like a death sentence, though Mark was very much alive. The disease stripped him of his independence, his dignity, and, most devastatingly, his ability to be the husband and father he had once been. It was as if Alina's Mark had been swallowed whole, leaving behind a man with clear eyes but an empty gaze, a man whose moments of clarity grew fewer and farther between. Caring for him became Alina's full-time job. She tried to manage it all. Her husband's care, the children's needs, the endless visits to doctors and pharmacies. But no matter how much she gave, it was never enough. The guilt gnawed at her constantly. She felt like a failure, overwhelmed by the weight of her responsibilities and the suffocating loneliness that had seeped into every corner of her life. That's when Daniel, their neighbor, had stepped in. Daniel had always been kind, the kind of neighbor who lent a hand without being asked. When Mark's condition worsened, he began to help more and more, bringing groceries, fixing the leaking sink, even cooking meals when Alina couldn't find the energy. At first, she was hesitant to accept his help, too proud to admit how much she needed it. But as the weeks stretched into months, she realized she couldn't do it alone. Daniel was a quiet man, soft-spoken but dependable. He didn't flinch when Mark had one of his bad episodes, the moments when he would scream or cry without reason. He didn't complain about the late-night calls or the heavy lifting. He simply showed up, unassuming but constant, like a steady anchor in a turbulent sea. Alina found herself looking forward to his visits. It wasn't just the physical help, though that was invaluable. It was the way he listened. Unlike the doctors who spoke in clinical terms or the well-meaning friends who offered empty platitudes, Daniel seemed to genuinely understand the depth of her exhaustion. One evening, after Mark had finally fallen asleep and the children were tucked into bed, Daniel stayed for tea. They sat at the kitchen table, the silence between them warm and comfortable. "You're doing an incredible job, you know," he said, his voice low but firm. Alina let out a bitter laugh. "It doesn't feel like it. Most days, I feel like I'm failing everyone. Mark, the kids, myself." Daniel reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. "You're stronger than you think, Alina." The touch lingered, and for a moment, the air between them shifted. Alina pulled her hand back, guilt stabbing at her like a knife. She thanked him for his help and quickly saw him out, but that night she lay awake, her mind replaying the fleeting connection they had shared. It happened on a rainy evening in November. The day had been especially hard. Mark had fallen while trying to get to the bathroom, and the children were fighting over something trivial. Alina's nerves were frayed, her patience worn thin. Daniel had come by to help lift Mark back into bed, and afterward, she had broken down. "I can't do this anymore," she sobbed, her face buried in her hands. "I'm so tired, Daniel. I feel like I'm disappearing." Daniel knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You're not alone," he said softly. "I'm here." When she looked up, their faces were inches apart. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the concern etched into his features. Without thinking, without planning, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was a moment of weakness, a desperate grasp for connection in the midst of her isolation. It was wrong, and she knew it, but for the first time in months, she felt seen, desired, alive. The kiss deepened, and before she knew it, they were tangled together in a way that felt both inevitable and forbidden. When it was over, Alina was overcome with shame. She pulled away, her breath shaky. I can't do this," she whispered. Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. "I understand," he said simply. "But if you ever need me, I'm here." In the days that followed, Alina threw herself into caring for Mark with renewed determination. She cooked his favorite meals, read to him from his old books, and sat by his side during his moments of clarity. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't erase the guilt that clung to her like a second skin. She avoided Daniel, refusing to answer his calls or open the door when he stopped by. She told herself it was for the best, that cutting him off was the only way to make things right. But the distance only made her feel lonelier, and the memory of their shared moment haunted her. One evening as she sat by Mark's bedside, he reached out and took her hand. His grip was weak, but his eyes, clear for the first time in weeks, locked onto hers. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alina's breath caught in her throat. "For what?" "For leaving you alone in this," he murmured. "You deserve better." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she shook her head. "Don't say that, Mark. You're still here. That's all that matters." But deep down, she wondered if he was right. Months passed, and Mark's condition continued to decline. The doctors said it was only a matter of time. Alina did everything she could to keep him comfortable, but the weight of her choices pressed down on her. One night, after the children had gone to bed, Daniel showed up at her door. She hesitated before letting him in, her heart pounding in her chest. "I couldn't stay away," he admitted. "I've been worried about you." Alina looked at him, torn between gratitude and guilt. "I can't do this, Daniel," she said. "I made a vow to Mark, and I can't break it." Daniel nodded, his expression pained. "I understand. But Alina, you need to think about yourself, too. You can't pour from an empty cup." His words lingered with her long after he left. In the end, Alina made a decision. She wrote a letter to Mark, pouring out her feelings, her guilt, her exhaustion, her love. She told him about Daniel, about the moment of weakness she had shared with him, and about the emptiness she had been trying to fill. When she finished, she placed the letter in a drawer, knowing Mark would never read it. It wasn't for him, it was for her. She realized that while she couldn't change the past, she could choose her future. And as she looked at her sleeping husband, she vowed to honor the man he had been, even as she prepared to let go of the man he had become. Because sometimes, love means holding on. And sometimes, it means knowing when to say goodbye. The spring sun streamed through the curtains, casting soft golden light across the room. Alina sat by Mark's bedside, holding his hand as he dozed. His breathing was shallow but steady, a reminder that his body was still here even if his mind was slipping further away each day. The children were outside in the yard, laughing as they played with their grandmother's dog. Alina could hear their voices through the open window, a bittersweet melody that filled her with both joy and heartache. She wanted to bottle this moment, to preserve it for the future when she would need it most. Mark stirred, his eyes fluttering open. For a brief moment, they were clear, bright, like the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. He looked at her, his lips parting as if he wanted to say something. "What is it, Mark?" she whispered, leaning closer. His voice was faint, barely audible. "Thank you for staying." Tears filled her eyes as she gripped his hand tighter. "Always," she said, her voice trembling. "I'll always be here." Mark's lips curved into the faintest smile before his eyes closed again. Alina stayed by his side, her heart breaking and mending all at once. She knew the end was near, but she also knew that this was her chance to say goodbye. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark passed away peacefully in his sleep. Alina held him until his body grew cold, her tears soaking into the fabric of his shirt. The grief was overwhelming, but beneath it was a sense of relief. Relief that he was no longer suffering, relief that he was finally at peace. And as the house filled with the quiet sound of her children's voices, Alina knew that she had to find a way to move forward. In the weeks following Mark's death, the house felt impossibly quiet. Alina moved through the days like a ghost, her every action weighed down by grief. She focused on her children, ensuring they had everything they needed, but her own needs were buried under layers of responsibility and sorrow. Daniel stopped by a few times, offering his condolences and help, but Alina kept him at arm's length. She wasn't ready to face the feelings she had for him, the complicated mixture of gratitude, guilt, and longing. One afternoon, as she was sorting through Mark's belongings, she found a small box tucked away in the back of his closet. Inside was a collection of keepsakes, a ticket stub from their first movie date, a pressed flower from their wedding day, a drawing one of their children had made years ago. At the very bottom was a letter, addressed to her in Mark's handwriting. With trembling hands, she opened it. "Dear Alina, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know one thing. You've always been my anchor, my light in the darkness. I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for me, especially in the hardest moments. You gave me a life full of love, and for that, I'll always be grateful. But Alina, I need you to do something for me. I need you to live. I need you to find happiness, even if it means letting go of me. Don't let guilt hold you back. Don't let the past chain you down. You deserve joy, love, and a life filled with light. Love always, Mark." Alina clutched the letter to her chest, her tears falling freely. For the first time since his death, she allowed herself to believe that moving forward wasn't a betrayal. It was what Mark wanted for her. Months turned into a year, and slowly, Alina began to rebuild her life. She found a part-time job at a local library, a quiet and comforting place where she could immerse herself in the world of books. The children adjusted surprisingly well, their resilience a constant source of inspiration for her. One day, as she was leaving the library, she ran into Daniel. It had been months since she'd last seen him, and the sight of him stirred something deep within her. "Alina," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "It's good to see you." "You too," she replied, her smile hesitant but genuine. They stood there for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I've missed you," he admitted. "But I didn't want to push. I figured you needed time." "I did," Alina said softly. "But I think I'm ready to move forward now." Daniel's eyes searched hers, as if trying to gauge her sincerity. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Mark wanted me to live, to find happiness. And I think I'd like to try." A smile spread across Daniel's face, and for the first time in a long time, Alina felt a flicker of hope. Dating Daniel wasn't easy. There were moments of hesitation, moments when Alina questioned if she was moving too quickly or if she was being fair to Mark's memory. But Daniel was patient, never pushing her beyond what she was comfortable with. He understood her grief, her guilt, her lingering fears. He listened when she needed to talk, gave her space when she needed to retreat, and celebrated her victories, no matter how small. The children were hesitant at first, unsure of how to feel about Daniel's presence in their lives. But over time, they grew to trust him. He wasn't trying to replace Mark. He was simply there to support them, to be a friend and ally in a world that had been turned upside down. Alina found herself smiling more, laughing more. She began to rediscover the parts of herself that she had buried under the weight of caregiving and grief. She started painting again, a hobby she had abandoned years ago. She took the kids on weekend trips, exploring new places and creating new memories. And through it all, Daniel stood by her side, a steady presence in a world that was still finding its balance. 2 years after Mark's passing, Alina found herself standing in her backyard, surrounded by friends and family. The air was warm, filled with the sound of laughter and the scent of blooming flowers. It wasn't a grand event, just a small gathering to celebrate the life they had built together, the life that Mark had encouraged her to embrace. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the yard, Alina stood beside Daniel, her hand resting in his. She looked out at her children, now thriving and happy, and felt a sense of peace she hadn't thought possible. Mark would always be a part of her, a chapter in her story that had shaped her in countless ways. But she had learned that life was meant to be lived, not just survived. And as she stood there, surrounded by love and laughter, she knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. One filled with hope, resilience, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow.